Gather round, kids, because today we're going to be talking about models. No, now come on, there's a time and place for that. No, the models we're going to be talking about are historical models. Ah, Christ, okay. Note to self, fire, video editor. Okay, now, back on track. You know how sometimes you get that eerie feeling that history kind of repeats itself? Like those times when you get that eerie feeling that history kind of repeats itself? This idea of history rhyming, although not directly repeating, comes from the Greek historian Thucydides, who said that so long as human nature remains as it was in his day, people will, when placed in similar situations, act in similar ways. Now, unfortunately, Thucydides tragically died before all of recorded history could play itself out for his viewing pleasure, so what I'm going to do in this series is use my more advantageous temporal position in order to prove him right by showing you 3 different important historical models that crop up throughout history in all sorts of interesting ways. Today's model is the military expedition, and it has 8 key traits. First, the offender is an empire looking either to extend their territory or spread their form of government. Second, the expedition occurs around the same time as a related war. Third, the empire's expedition goes to what can be considered a far-off land by the standards of the era. Fourth, the empire's lack of familiarity with and preparedness for the foreign terrain is a constant problem. Fifth, in spite of this, the empire assumes that the campaign will actually be easy because they're invading a comparatively small or powerless territory, which, sixth, is always seen by the empire as some version of the other. Seventh, it always fails horribly. And eighth, it always results in some form of cultural shift or regime change after the empire fails. So let's take a look. Our first example comes to us straight from Thucydides in his form of the Athenians' famed Sicilian expedition. For those of you who've seen my video on Alcibiades, you know exactly where this one's going. First off, Athens, as we know, was an empire during the time of the Peloponnesian War. Most of their holdings were in the Aegean Sea, but they had allies to the west in Sicily, whom they used as an excuse to justify a full invasion of the island. Now, I don't know about you guys, but using a friendship of all things to justify an invasion and then the co-opting of valuable resources seems pretty unforgivable to me.
Hey dude, we're using your TV for an impromptu Star Wars tournament? Oh, also your mom got us cookies.
Carry on. Anyway, why they thought it was a good idea to launch such a campaign while still butting heads with Sparta is beyond me, although my suspicion is that all that headbutting with Sparta killed some important brain cells in that decision-making process. For your visual reference, this is some of what you get when you look up Peloponnesian War map on Google, not Bing because Bing is stupid. Note that none of these show Sicily. At all. While it may not seem so to us now, what with the ridiculous level of connectivity and high-speed transport we have whizzing around these days, Sicily was pretty far away by ancient Greek standards. What's worse, when the Athenians got to Sicily, they had expected that the people of the land would be sympathetic to them and welcome them with gifts and women and food and other stuff you give people in the ancient world. Whatever, I don't know. Because, friendship and stuff. But the Sicilians were very much not on board with the whole welcome Athenians thing, which honestly the Athenians should have seen coming because no one liked the Athenians back then. Furthermore, the location of the Athenian base, which was tactically and prudently located in a swamp, made everyone sick and also wrecked the triremes that were docked there. Far off land 2, Empire 0. Finally, you know how this one ends. Those pesky Dorian Syracusans kicked the crap out of the Athenians, the whole thing is a rout, and democracy was overthrown in an oligarchic coup shortly thereafter. Jump cut to 1812, and our next event is where we get the moral of many a children's bedtime story. Don't invade Russia in the winter, kids! It's an amazingly common strategy for some reason. I personally don't see the appeal. There's nothing here! Now, this is Napoleon's well-known attempts to do exactly that. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, Napoleon decided that France sounded much nicer than Europe, so he set out to conquer everything in sight and make it so. He directed his elf eyes eastward, to Russia, which, despite being larger than your evil 6th grade algebra teacher and twice as cold, didn't strike Napoleon as being all that imposing, as he thought of it as a backwards country and not all that serious of a threat. He was proven wrong almost immediately by the sheer incendiary bird-flipping madness that was the Russian peasantry, as even though his initial march into Russia went well, Napoleon quickly discovered that the Russian peasants were content to set fire to their crops as a giant, burning middle finger to the French before they could take control of the land. The Russian citizens essentially pulled the country out from under the invaders, leaving the 600,000 French soldiers essentially stranded in the middle of nowhere with no food and no supplies. Now, some historians tried to claim that the campaign failed because, quote, winter came early and it was colder than usual, which is complete garbage. Winter is as cold as it always is in Russia, and it starts at the same damn time every year. The French were simply expecting that the weather would just, bow down to them in the face of their fancy waistcoats and oblige by warming up by roughly 50 degrees. Soldiers were dropping from hunger, thirst, sickness, and cold just as much as they were dropping from bullets, and also the base. By the time they got to Moscow, they had only a fourth of the army they started with, and Moscow was also, casually, on fire. Scorched earth at its finest. Just taking that delectable, smoky aroma. Now, here's a little conquer pro tip. Never invade a country that can and will demolish itself far more efficiently than you ever could hope to do. If they burn down their capital just to spite you, you have already been outclassed. Unable to do anything with the burning remains of Moscow, Napoleon and co. went back to France, and much as was the case with Sicily, the French suffered similarly from hunger and cold on their way back, as they were gradually picked off by the Russians, and later her allies joined in on the fun, as they went all the way back to Paris. Only 10,000 of the original 600,000 returned to the city. It's the same feeling you get when you leave a toothbrush in a hotel, except in this case the hotel is Russia and the toothbrush is more like 590,000 lives. So yeah, basically the same thing. So as a consequence to all that invasion nonsense, Napoleon was exiled, the Bourbon kings were reinstated, and the Russians made France cede all of their imperial gains back to their rightful owners. So remember kids, never forget to dress for the weather when you go out with your friends to fight a land war in Asia. Speaking of more land wars in Asia, we're going further east and a little bit south to the American involvement in the Vietnam War. Note, the mechanics of this war are very similar to American operations in the Middle East over the past few decades. But for the sake of historical clarity, and also because my notion of American history pretty much vanishes entirely by the time the 80s rolls around, we're sticking with Vietnam. So, first off, America is not an empire by the traditional sense, and they weren't technically spreading their territory like the other two, but it's no coincidence that everything from road signs to menus all over the world have English translations, and also that America has had the strongest military in the world for more than half a century.
It was our language first, damn it, and we were a proper empire until you ruined everything.
Dude, just let it go. Point is, America is, for our purposes, an empire, and their objective was to spread their global influence in the form of democracy. It's like a worldwide Cold War episode of The Bachelor. It was in their direct interest to spread democracy to combat the spread of Russian communism in Asia and beyond. This is a bit of where the cold part gets into the Cold War. America and Russia were fighting a battle of global influence, and a nice metric of that is whose form of government a given nation adopted. So America flew all the way around the world to wage a proxy war against Russia and Vietnam because America honestly thought they could win. Check, 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 and check. A problem for the Americans in Vietnam was the dense and unforgiving jungle they spent most to all of their time fighting in. The North Vietnamese army in Viet Cong's guerrilla warfare proved to be exceptionally difficult for the Americans to manage, in part because they were still fresh from the World Wars. America, accustomed to a much more organized and urban type of warfare, was very much not used to the flush every last enemy out strategy that this kind of war entailed. Even with almost 2 million soldiers fighting against less than 500,000 communists, the operation was still unwinnable because of how careful and crafty the comparatively dinky force of communists was compared to the Americans and their allies. By the time America realized the campaign had failed and the North Vietnamese army overtook South Vietnam, the popular opinion at home in the States was more anti-war than it had been since probably the Civil War. These anti-war protests contributed to substantial political upheaval in the States. Check, check, and check. While, thankfully, this expedition was not as ruinous for America as it had been for Athens and France, it was still widely considered to be ill-advised, complicated, unnecessary, and doomed to fail. So, we've just covered 3 very disparate instances set in totally different places with entirely different players, and yet they all seem to fit into the same neat little model that we've seen repeat itself since literally the beginning of recorded history, because hubris straight up sucks. And if you're not convinced that we're a stunningly predictable species yet, well, I've got 2 more videos on the way that just might change your mind. After all, it wouldn't be the first time.